The next 6 questions, numbered 10 through 15, are taken from a science passage. You can usually determine what type of passage you are going to read. It's usually indicated somewhere in the italics. Remember that all passages start with italics, and almost always the italics will tell you what type of reading you are dealing with. Typical of science passages, the italics are very, very short and to the point. They tell you that this is a sociological study on the use of nighttime hours. Science readings such as this usually only have one perspective, the perspective of the science writer. So there's not going to be a discussion of different historical points of views. There's not going to be a novel. It's not going to be anything about tone or ethnicity that you find on other writings. It's usually pretty straightforward. In this passage there are 5 short paragraphs. After each paragraph we'll discuss what you should have picked up. Let's begin. The science passages, just like all the other passages, require you to carefully read at the beginning. One of the most common errors that students commit on the SAT reading is they try to read the first paragraph too quickly. They skim through the passage too quickly. Sometimes they look at the questions first. No, on all SAT readings, that first paragraph is very important because it really sets up the main idea. And certainly this passage did that. The first 2 sentences are sort of vague and fuzzy. It's hard to understand what they're talking about. You're talking about enlarging our realm, spreading further. These sentences are difficult to understand and very, very vague. But that third sentence, let me quote it. Quote, "If an element is forbidding, we devise a means to master it." Unquote. That sentence more or less sums up the main idea of this whole passage. Reading the remainder of this paragraph, you can see what they're talking about. Once we fill up space and reach shores, we find some other land to live in. If we are cold in the Arctic, we find clothing that allows us to live in the Arctic. So I think the main idea here can be expressed in the following way. When we reach a limit, humans figure out a way to go beyond that limit. Let's talk about your method of reading. Most students have a method. They really don't know what that method is. Some look at the questions first. Some students skim the passage or look at the first sentence of each paragraph. There's different methods. All of those methods may have value at school, perhaps at home, perhaps other places, but they do not have value on the SAT. I think the only method that works is the one that we're using as we discuss this passage. What we're doing is we analyze what type of passage we're going to read, and then we read a paragraph, or if it's a long paragraph, we break up the paragraph into parts, and we then summarize that paragraph. It really works. Let's go to the next paragraph. This is a very short paragraph. However, because the paragraph does appear toward the beginning of the passage, you should therefore read it carefully, more carefully than you read the material at the end of the passage. If you read this, I think you can sum it up in the following manner. We are turning into a 24-hour society. Paragraph 3 is a relatively long paragraph. At this point, the passage starts repeating a lot of the earlier ideas that have already been established. The first sentence is important, especially when you recognize that it sets up an analogy. It states, quote, "This extension across all hours of the day resembles our spreading across the face of the earth," unquote. The writer of this article is now going to establish how people spreading across the earth into new lands is analogous to us spreading from just working and utilizing only the daylight hours to working and living in the evening as well. It is always useful to sum up in your own mind what was the main idea of this paragraph, and I think it was the following. Similar to the way we expanded from one end of the earth to the other to fill it up, we are now expanding from working only daylight to working 24 hours a day. Let's go to paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 is very short, and it really doesn't add a lot of new information. It's basically repeating everything that has been stated before. So let's proceed to the 5th and last paragraph. Not surprisingly, the last paragraph is probably the least important paragraph. It does introduce a slightly new subject. So far, the ideas have centered around the analogy of how people expanded geographically. Now they're expanding from daytime activity only to 24 hours a day activity. This paragraph is explaining why people might use the night, why people using the night think it's useful, and why they might actually like using the night activity. But for the most part, it's ancillary to the main idea. Now let's look at the questions. Before you start on the questions, you should take a few seconds to recall what the main ideas were as you were reading the passage. The first and most important idea was that when we human beings reach a limit, humans figure out a way to go beyond those limits. It further illustrated this in terms of an analogy. It said that similar to the way we expanded from one end of the earth to the other, we are now expanding from working only daylight to working 24 hours a day. The general theme of this entire passage is that our society is turning into a 24-hour-a-day society. The last few paragraphs offered very little. It's very typical, but it did suggest that there are reasons of why people might actually utilize and enjoy nighttime activities. Knowing this, now let's look at the questions. The importance of the main idea can be illustrated with number 10. Remember, several of the ideas that we talked about in the passage were the following. When we reach a limit, humans figure out a way to go beyond that limit. And second, similar to the way we expanded from one end of the earth to the other, we are now expanding from working only daylight to working 24 hours a day. That main idea should be reflected in one of the choices that reflects one of these main ideas. Number 10 is clearly a main idea question. Now, as we do with all passages, we look for the choices that we can eliminate first. Remember, you generally can eliminate 3, maybe 4 choices. Let's take a look at choices A and B first. The author is not persuading the reader to increase the use of nighttime hours, nor is he illustrating the vibrancy or beauty of nighttime activity. He sounds rather neutral to both of these ideas. He's a scientist. He wants to sound scientific. The author only suggests that we use nighttime activities because we've run out of the time that we need to do things during the daytime. We can also easily eliminate C. I think C is the easiest choice to eliminate. The writer never suggests that nighttime activity or any activity he really mentioned was harmful to humans. Thus, A, B, and C can easily be eliminated. D and E are a little bit more difficult to eliminate because they both have elements of truth in them. Choice E states that the correct choice would be critique the way in which changing labor patterns have come to dominate human life. That may be suggested, but was it the main idea? Clearly, the author is suggesting that nighttime activity is becoming more important, but was that the main idea? No, the main idea was when we reach limits, humans figure out how to go beyond those limits, and that similar to the way we expanded from Earth to Earth geographically, we are now expanding from working only daylight to working 24 hours a day. This is putting the main idea in relationship to history, and that's why choice D is correct. Main idea questions are usually fairly simple. You can usually eliminate 3 of the choices very easily. We did in this case A, B, and C. You generally come down to 2 choices, and you have to figure out which one most closely relates to the main idea. Let's go on to number 11. Number 11 is a SAT reading vocabulary question. The reading vocabulary on the SAT does not involve difficult words. It does not involve difficult semantics, as we saw earlier on the sentence completions. However, it does test your ability to understand the difference of meanings of common words that you may be familiar with. For example, the word principle might mean head of a school. It might be a scientific principle. It might be a moral principle. The word principle might mean the main or major thing. For example, I was the principal advocate of the policy. I was the main advocate of the policy. English words have lots of meaning. So when you look at a question that is clearly a vocabulary question, you have to treat it as a question where you have to find the narrow meaning that's presented in the question itself. Most of the questions on the SAT reading are about main ideas. This is the closest you get to a detailed question. You can always tell that it's a vocabulary question because it almost always has these words in it. Most, nearly, means. Number 11 actually used these words. It stated that in line blah blah, rhythms most nearly means. Rarely do you actually have to go back and look at details, but this type of question, the SAT reading vocabulary question, requires you to do exactly that. You have to go back and look at the word itself and perhaps the sentence before and after that word. In this case it said, and having first occupied much of the usable space in the world, we are now filling its usable time. Although being wakeful at night flouted our natural rhythms, we developed artificial lighting that let us be active after dark. Notice that I normally start about 1 sentence before the actual sentence they refer to. The word rhythms is what we wanted. We started 1 sentence ahead of that. If a stranger were to ask you, what's the meaning of rhythm? The first thing that might come to your mind might be something to deal with music, because music and rhythm go together. The SAT rarely uses the primary meaning. In this case, the primary meaning of rhythm might have something to do with music. So the answer is not C. Generally speaking, the SAT loves secondary or tertiary meanings. It's fairly easy to understand this probably has nothing to do with an accent or migration. This is dealing with being awake at night, and that has more to do with biological patterns, so the correct answer is E. Fortunately, on the SAT reading, the vocabulary questions are usually some of the easiest questions involved. Certainly, number 11 was indeed an easy question. It was a level 1. It was the only level 1 in this particular passage. Practically everything else was a level 3. Let's go on to the next question. With number 12, we return to the average level of difficulty. Number 12 is a level 3. We also return to the main idea type of question. Remember, number 11 was a vocabulary question. You generally only get 1 of those in a passage. Rarely you get 2, but normally just 1. Most of the questions are main ideas, and indeed this is a main idea question. It gets back to one of the fundamental main ideas that we talked about already. That main idea was that we are a 24-hour society. The question itself refers us to 4 or 5 sentences. You might choose to stop the recording and read those sentences now. However, the whole point of this is the writer is giving us lots of examples of activities that can occur both during the day and during the night. The writer of this passage mentions factory shift work, airports, gasoline stations, hotels, restaurants, etc., etc. All of these things that can occur at night. He actually uses the word astir at night. Traditionally, a lot of these activities were daytime activities, but now they are nighttime activities. This reinforces the concept that we are turning into a 24-hour society. It's fairly obvious this has nothing to do with space and time, nor does it have anything to do with companionship. That's choice C. I think you can obviously eliminate choices D and E also. I don't think this has anything to do with ambition and greed, which is choice C, nor work and recreation. Maybe work but not recreation, so that rules out E. So you can eliminate choices A, C, D, and E. The correct answer involves the uses of nighttime and daytime activities, so the correct choice is in fact B. The value of this question is to reinforce the concept that you are looking for main ideas. The actual sentences that they refer to here, there's 5 sentences, really won't tell you the answer. They won't tell you the correct answer is the use of nighttime and daytime. That comes from how you derive the main idea. If you did not get the main idea, you will not get the question correct. You cannot go back and look at those 5 lines and independently find that information. Number 13 is again a level 3, a medium level question, and as number 12 it reverts back to the concept of a main idea. In this case, we have to remember that the main idea of the passage as presented in the 3rd paragraph was that similar to the way we expanded from one end of the earth to the other, we are now expanding in terms of time of day. We were once only a daytime society, now we're both a daytime and night society. The particular references that they ask you to look at, the look, hover, and watch, are presented in a parallel form of verbal constructions. This form of writing, which is in my opinion very neat and tidy, is not very odd for science writings. The science writings on the SAT are very straightforward. Other types of readings on the SAT are very vague and very hard to understand. This is pretty straightforward. Question 13 illustrates a point I briefly made earlier. You're trying to find wrong answers, not correct answers. If you look at choice A, there's really nothing in this passage to suggest a threat of unbounded migration has anything to do with the main idea. And there's really nothing about the main idea wanting you to explore the night sky. There are some references to nighttime activities, but these activities are not limited to leisure activities as choice D suggests. So we should eliminate choice D. I don't think they're trying to prepare us for anticipated changes in choice C. So A, B, D, and E really don't offer good choices. On the other hand, the focus upon history is very important here, and C is the correct answer. Let us proceed to number 14. Number 14 refers to the word both. That's in the 3rd paragraph, the same paragraph that we were just dealing with in question 13. And again, you have to look at one of the main ideas that we talked about earlier. That was that the passage said that similar to the way we expanded from one end of the earth to the other, we are now expanding from working daylight to 24 hours a day. You simply cannot get away from the main idea on these passages. They're talking about 2 ideas, the expansion physically of man in space. That is, in terms of running out of territory and the expansion of man in time, both daytime and nighttime. Choice A is totally irrelevant. This had nothing to do with worker productivity. B is equally sort of silly. Scientific knowledge, they really didn't talk about that. Nor did they talk about competing work demands and available time. Well, maybe available time, but certainly not work demands. Nor did they ever talk about national borders. It's about space, people running out of space and finding new places to live, and people running out of daylight hours and figuring out how to utilize nighttime hours. So the correct choice is E, available space and time, usable time. Choice E. Let's go to number 15. Number 15 is also a level 3, a medium level problem, and if you understood the main idea of the passage, this should be relatively simple. If you recall, the last paragraph just offered some useful activities that might occur at night. The writer gave a variety of different activities. If you understood the main idea, you're trying to find a activity presented here that was not presented in the passage itself that might illustrate how you can utilize the nighttime activity that normally would be thought of as a typical daytime activity. You should easily eliminate choices C, D, and E. C has nothing to do with time, it's just space. D has only something to do with lunch hour times, nothing to do with night. And E typically only deals with nighttime activity. It doesn't deal with could you utilize it both during the day and during the night. Curfew laws only deal with nighttime activities. So C, D, and E are easily eliminated. While B at first might seem to be an attractive choice, you can eliminate that too, because night guards in a museum only exist because they're night guards. It has nothing to do with utilizing typical daytime activities. The correct choice was, of course, choice A, and we normally think of classes as being typically a daytime type of activity. Education is typically daytime. As our society progresses, we find ourselves using the schools more and more during the evening times, especially universities. So the correct choice is A for number 15. Let's go to the next passage.